Miss Kate Fairlie has a master's from Oxford University in Sustainable Development, and she works for a globally respected Australian surveying company, Land Equity International, as a land administration specialist. From their work in the region, she will present 4 case studies from Asia Pacific, linking land and climate.
Just give me a second, I'll start my video as well. I think the host needs to enable my video, so I'll leave that to you, Roshni, and otherwise I'll start. Thank you, Clarissa. Thank you, Professor Chen. That was an excellent, here we go, start my video. That was an excellent overview, and likewise with Clarissa, I'm really impressed at how rapidly China is able to mobilize on many of these issues. My partner works in solar, so he's had a long partnership with China, and it's certainly a very interesting field. So I'm hopefully diving down a little bit deeper into sort of the land and surveying space. My name is Kate Fairlie, as beautifully introduced by Clarissa. Thank you very much. I'm a land administration specialist with Land Equity International, based in Australia, but working across sort of Africa, Asia Pacific in terms of what we do. So to start off, let me try and, oh, that's interesting. There we go. Okay, obviously my clicks are a little bit slow. Really quick outline. I'm going to try and jump straight into it. I'm going to a deep dive into 4 case studies, projects, probably starting off with a little bit more detail in Nauru and Papua, a little bit less detail in the Mekong and Bangladesh, to leave you space to all ask questions. And just to give you a little bit of an overview, a good navigator will always tell you where you're going. Let me quickly summarize what I see as the key climate change elements of each of these projects. Whilst my background is in surveying, I really feel like I'm working extensively in climate change at the moment. But as part of those, I've also sort of drawn out what I see as sort of the land related entry points that we're really working in each of these projects. So let us start with Nauru. So Nauru is a tiny island in the Pacific. If we were in the room together, I'd probably do a show of hands to see how many of you knew where it was. And it is around 21 square kilometres in area, I think, and around a population of 10,000 people. So very, very small, and obviously suffering from many of the challenges that many small island states do. So I've articulated some of those challenges. Nauru has a long colonial history, originally a Melanesian population, or still a Melanesian population, but extensively impacted by colonial powers. So they've been variously occupied by the Germans, the Japanese, the British and Australian forces. Around 80% of the island has been mined for phosphate. This is concentrated in the interior, you can see from this artist's impression. And it means that the interior is now barren, it's uninhabitable, and it's created a further disconnect for the customary landowners. And it requires a huge amount of money in terms of rehabilitation, which is the responsibility of the national government. Due to its remoteness, access to housing materials in Nauru is pretty limited. As a result, houses are poorly maintained. There's not really a strong culture of maintenance, but I think that's influenced by the inability to access resources to maintain houses. Exacerbating this, there are not enough houses. Many houses are homes to extended families, and this has led to often crowded conditions, which is a common thing in many developing countries. Nauru was also particularly exposed during the COVID pandemic. 90% of the country's food is imported. So this is a real risk, a recognised risk to ongoing security and sovereignty. All right, and then moving through, Nauru's GDP can be roughly split up into 3 areas. So the phosphate mining, fishing rights for mainly tuna, and Australia's refugee processing centre. At least 2 of these have relatively uncertain futures dependent on other countries' economies. And then like with many small island developing states, I'm sure Charisse will go into this more, Nauru is potentially going to suffer from sea level rise, tidal inundation, storms, and already experiencing the extremes of water scarcity through to flooding. So the Nauru government introduced the Nauru Higher Ground Initiative, and this has a vision for a safe, secure, and resilient future for Nauru. But what does this mean for LEI? We were brought in to help with the development of a vision and master plan to achieve this resilient future. And our particular role was around reviewing the tenure needs and supporting social safeguards. So in these two images, you can see Nauru. The first is taken from Google Earth, and it shows the outline. Hopefully you can see this is relatively well populated, but it's relatively sparse in the center. And the team that we've been working with has developed a master plan, which is shown on the right. And this is extending the urban area. You can see sort of where the red circles are through to this government-owned land called Land Portion 230. The island's around 90% customary land. So government typically leases land, but in this unique instance has purchased a land portion to kick off this higher ground initiative. And the significant area you can see by the green sort of rectangles for agriculture and the green sort of wavy areas, which is for conservation. And these two land uses don't really exist on the island today. So what does this mean in terms of what we actually did? The work's ongoing. We've been working there for a couple of years, but we're interrupted by COVID and the inability to get on the island. So far, we've reviewed the land tenure situation, looking at the gaps between particularly law and practice, and really flagging that existing laws have been written for the heavy dominance of phosphate mining, and they don't actually provide a solid foundation for conservation, for government-owned land. There's no basis for government to own land, for things like compulsory acquisition, which may or may not be something the government wants, and so on. Other key components include public awareness raising, and I'm probably going to be emphasizing that a lot during this talk. So there's a lot of, I guess we've really put a lot of effort into demonstrating the value of awareness raising, consultation, co-development and co-ownership of land administration approaches. I shouldn't overstate our work. There's still a long way to go, but public consultations have commenced. There's a link to the website, I think on the previous slide. So some of this information is starting to get out, and we're putting in place a process so that people can have more of a say in this master plan moving forward. I've included training there, training in terms of particularly dispute resolution and negotiation, because when we're dealing with land, there's a lot of conflict. It's really values-based, and it's really important that people sort of from the government and from the public feel empowered to have their say, but can also do so in a way that is not going to exacerbate conflict, but might actually lead to a resolution. Another task is communicating the role of the cadastre and land information systems, and particularly the value of standards, transparent and efficient processes, and how these can underpin national climate change responses, which is what we're talking about here. And the final one is social safeguarding. I don't feel like we routinely mention this in surveying and FIG circles, but I do think that it's pretty fundamental to what we do. It's something that a lot of international development partners are really emphasizing. And a key part of this is really understanding the social impact of, for example, infrastructure projects, and mitigating those negative impacts, particularly where they may be unfairly experienced by minorities, often women, often Indigenous peoples, disabled peoples, and other excluded groups. So I don't want to spend too much time on Nauru because there's a lot of other contexts, but I guess for each of the projects, I've been thinking a little bit about what does this mean in terms of further spaces that we need to address as land professionals. And Nauru is really highlighting for me sort of this intersection with customary land, and particularly how, you know, international experts, often white experts, previous colonizers, and in Nauru in particular, customary land ownership covers 90% of the island. So it's pretty key. And it's a very tricky area. Western surveyors and practitioners need to do better at listening to traditional custodians in our own countries as well as internationally. But there's also this nature of customary land practices where they're evolving, and I guess there's a lot of nuance and they're different in a lot of different geographies. So for Nauru, some of the key questions I think are around how do you maintain this customary land ownership and customary practices, even though they've been so impacted by colonisation to date, and how can they be incentivized or perhaps supported to change in a way that will enable better conservation on the island, and enable more sustainability on the island, because at the moment there's a little bit of a disconnect between those different practices. For Nauru as well, there's also the compulsory acquisition question, and I think this goes for other countries as well. Should customary land be able to be compulsorily acquired? So those are just some of the questions. There's certainly a lot more, and I'd really welcome more discussion on this and your own sort of perspectives on that. All right, let me move on to Papua, a slightly larger population. The Papuan provinces lie in the far east of Indonesia, neighbouring Papua New Guinea. They're some of the most heavily forested in Indonesia, and conserving and protecting these forests is recognised, has been recognised within Indonesia as fundamental to achieving their climate change goals. Spatial planning is the work that we were doing in Papua, and we see it as fundamental to the protection of forests. Deforestation in Indonesia, as you can see, accounts for around 80% of Indonesia's greenhouse gas emissions. So they've achieved a huge amount so far in terms of addressing that, but there's still a long way to go. Spatial planning is a key mechanism to do so, but suffers from many of these areas as listed on the screen. Some of the other challenges are that around 50 million Indonesians are dependent on forests to survive, but forests are typically government owned. Conservation, protection and production are sort of the different forest designations, and there's not a specific designation necessarily for Indigenous peoples, but this is changing. There's also the international element, where initiatives such as the Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade, the EU FLECT, which is implemented by the European Union, has put in measures in place to reduce illegal logging, requiring supply chain traceability, but this needs data, and it needs the sign-on of local governments as well as sort of international bodies. So our project was to establish a technical assistance facility for improved spatial planning and low carbon development, with a focus on Papua and West Papua provinces. But we also had the technical assistance facility based in Jakarta, and then so supporting both national and district and provincial level governments. The project was funded by the UK government and was implemented in partnership with the Indonesian government. And in practice, this meant really a lot of partnership. So we were strengthening spatial planning, assisting different governments, but partnering with a range of actors to achieve that. So what have I got here? I've got partnerships first. I've mentioned that already. There were a range of actors. And I guess really recognising that land doesn't exist in isolation, spatial planning doesn't, and these touch on a range of other issues, including health, education, business, so on. So it's really important to build those connections and ensure that we understand what different sectors are doing and that we're all moving in the same direction. A key part of the project was also working across government, which I mentioned before. In Indonesia, the national level standards for spatial data are excellent, and there's really strong capacity at the central levels. But it's such a huge country, a huge population, and there's really large distances to cover. So local capacity is much weaker. Meeting some of those strict standards, those strict timeframes can be really difficult coming from the really local level government. So this is where building sustainable capacity comes in. It's not just about instructor-led trainings, but we implemented a number of initiatives like learning on the job, mentoring, coaching, developing peer-to-peer networks, online user forums, lots of different touch points so that when the project finished, when we left, there was still a lot of capacity on the ground, and people felt empowered to continue their work. Community engagement was key. One of the things that I think is really, really cool is that the team developed an app to not only allow people to access the land and spatial planning data, but to be able to report possible logging infractions. And this then the government staff could investigate. So this is citizen-generated data, but it's incorporating that into the formal domain, which I think is really interesting. and also keeping in mind sort of the ethics around of this. So likewise, we're really proud that this project was instrumental in getting customary land information, ADAT land, recognised and integrated into district and provincial spatial plans. And we think this was the first instance of that happening. And that was really able to happen because of extensive consultation, lots of trust building, and this empowered ADAT communities to offer their data rather than us asking for it. And really creating that partnership between ADAT communities and government, which is a difficult thing to navigate. And then just quickly on innovation, there were a range of other things that were achieved, supporting the government around RED+, recognising the coexistence of sustainable, but also sustainability and conservation, but also Indigenous use of forests. Yeah, definitely ask more about that. I can go into much more detail. So here's some questions around that. I think that I won't go into too much on them because I probably am running out of time, but I've got a range of questions. All right. We had a project in the Mekong. We've got two projects going on in the Mekong at the moment. One is the Mekong Region Land Governance Project, and one is the Transformative Land Investment Project. And these really focus around policy influence, enabling smallholder farmers, but also connecting with the business sector. I think I'm going to run out of time here, so I'm just going to park them. These are the projects. There was one case study in particular that I wanted to talk to, which is around large-scale land concessions in Lao PDR. It's a huge way for governments to access money, for big-scale industry to access land, but there's a huge impact on smallholder farmers. COVID exacerbated all of these political economy dimensions. There was significant migration, but that was stopped. And there's just a lack of viability. So COVID really impacted the viability of this project. But it was a nice case of where we were able to sort of link the success of smallholder business and building that capacity with tenure security and land restoration. So I'm happy to go into more detail on that later on in the questions. Finally, because this links really nicely with what Professor Chen was talking about, a case study on Bangladesh, which is looking at implementing large-scale renewable energy. We had a strong focus on solar, but we were also paying some attention to wind. Bangladesh is facing a huge crisis. 2023 saw the most number of power outages I think they've ever had. They've got significant fuel shortages. And funnily enough, transitioning to renewable energy is actually cheaper for them. They would save money. But there's that ability and that momentum to do so. And access to land is a key limitation, limited by both sort of the population and the topography, as well as poor quality data. So quickly, I think I know someone on the chat mentioned GIS. We developed a decision support system. Nothing really that new there, but the new bit that I do want to talk about is that the technical is really hard, really easy, as we know, but the social data is hard. And finding that social data, recording that social data, and integrating that social data within GIS systems, or within spatial data, within policy, is also really difficult. So that's something we've worked on. We've put a little bit in there, but there's still a way to go. And I'm looking to do a bit of a study around there's a number of decision support tools for things like implementing, accessing land for solar energy, solar and wind. But I don't think very many of them integrate social data. So I'm looking at sort of how we can integrate that social safeguard information into those kind of tools. All right, so just quickly, I've sort of been working on a bit of a thing around why do we do land administration and what are all the different touch points. I think for environment, we've covered a lot. This is definitely not all of them. But I think we can really nicely articulate for each of these what the entry points are for surveying. And I know this is something that sort of Roshni, Clarissa and others are working on. So I tried to build out a little bit here in terms of what I think, but I'm happy to have more of a discussion around that. Really welcome your questions and insights. And I think that's all for me. Hopefully that wasn't over time. Thank you, Clarissa and team.
Thank you very much, Kate. Actually, you still had 4 minutes left.
I've still got 4 minutes. There you go. Well, I can go back and talk about one of the case studies more if you want. Let me see.
Well, why don't you give us that fourth case study, but just within a 3-minute quick burst, because they really are fascinating.
But Bangladesh or the Mekong one?
The Mekong one, I
The
think, is the
Mekong
one you missed.
Yeah, I skipped over that. Apologies. Obviously, I got a bit flustered. All right. Well, I overviewed it a little bit. But essentially, we've been working in 4 countries in the Mekong, and really focusing on smallholder farmers and how they can impact the policy space. In this context, there was a lot of interest in having a large-scale land concession over this area in the Phuket province, which you can see is in the northwest of Laupedia. But there's a lot of problems with large-scale land concessions in the Mekong area, and typically these can lead to deforestation, dispossession. Indigenous forest dwellers can lose their rights and be evicted from a forest, for want of a better way of saying that. And there's a lot of impact from pesticides, where the large sort of scale farming and even the local farmers to some extent are using pesticides without understanding what the impact can be on sort of the wider ecosystem, but also farmers who might be trying to farm in more sort of organic and natural ways. In this case, there was a boutique. There's a lot of different wild teas in the region, and there was an opportunity from an NGO to develop sort of a boutique tea farm. And it was recognised that this is really sought after by particularly Western markets, but also a little bit in Laos as well. But the community was lacking a lot of the training in terms of identifying the tea varieties, how to market this business, how to do the export, different ways of harvesting the tea, and different business practices. And these are things as surveyors that we don't normally touch on. But there was a really close linkage between that and tenure security. For example, ensuring that different members of the community weren't impinging on each other's rights in terms of either the village boundary or their own individual parcel boundaries, depending on whether that was communal or not. And then also in terms of what the local government was going to do in terms of allocating that land for land concessions. And often the local people don't have much of a say over whether or not a land concession is granted. So in this case, the team was able to negotiate with government to say, we will make this a viable business. And if we can do that, then you will grant us that tenure security and recognise our rights here and not grant the land to the land concession. So that was a huge success until COVID hit. When COVID hit, that impacted the viability of the business. They weren't able to sort of get the tea out. And there's no monetary safety net there. Whereas this is another political economy thing, where often there's a lot of concessions or support that's given to large-scale actors, but the recognition is not there for the small-scale actors. So I actually need to do a bit more investigating in terms of whether the project is still going, but it was a really nice case of linking business in areas that are not traditionally seen as ours with the tenure security side of things. So thank you, Clarissa. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you for that final analysis of showing what tools are required in specific situations. That's exactly what we need.